Hello, everyone. Thank you, Ambassador, for being with us today. Our guest today is former Venezuelan ambassador and the founder of ARIA Formula Meetings. He will talk to us about the recent developments in Venezuela. He'll make a brief remark, and then he's ready to take your questions. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. You know, one of the best memories that I keep of my time at the United Nations was that I was here. The offices were not so good as they are today, and I got a plaque from the UNCA people, which I feel very honored. And I was telling you that the first press conference given by a president of the United Nations Security Council, it was my privilege to have it, and it was here. And the Secretariat was very uncomfortable. I remember Jonah, who was the Undersecretary General, came down to tell me that the President of the Security Council never gave a press conference. I said, well, I invite you to see the first one. You know, I feel very weird, actually, that having to return to the United Nations to defend my country when we, for so many years, were the defenders of other countries, the plight of Congo, Rwanda, Sudan, Bosnia, Salvador, other places in the world, when we had a vibrant, committed democracy working within the spirit of the United Nations Charter. Today, as we all know, I'm not going to repeat it, and I'll be very short, we are going through the biggest possible tragedy that Latin America has ever seen. For a country that has about 4 million people forced to live outside Venezuela with the worst inflation. I don't want to tire you with these kinds of details because the United Nations have produced enough reports of the human rights violations. But I want to tell a couple of things to describe, like I would say, the nature of the beast. What are we facing today in Venezuela? To begin with, there is no government. There is no legitimate government. Since January 10th, 54 of the democracies of the Western world have considered the Maduro regime is illegitimate. So the constitutionality does not exist. The second, that it has become, Venezuela has morphed into a major narco state that is not only dangerous for us, but it's extremely dangerous for the region and for peace and stability. Pablo Escobar, that you all know, was never president of Colombia. Chapo Guzman was never president of Mexico. But their equivalents in Venezuela are the presidents of Venezuela, the vice president. Maduro is being charged, even his wife, in the Kingpin list, in the Canadian, as drug traffickers, money launderers, and human rights violators. The president of the Venezuelan Supreme Court, the illegitimate one, has been processed by 2 assassinations. These are the characters, and Diosdado Cabello, the president of the illegal National Constituency, is also indicted by drug trafficking and monumental crimes. So I think it's very important to know who are leading this regime. And even though those are realities, Maduro, adopted son and nephew, is being held in prison here for committing the crime of drug trafficking. So the nature of the beast is very clear. Recently, we saw what happened in the last 2 days. In my view, and I'll be very candid, it was the beginning of a long day, a day that cannot be counted in 24 hours. People talk about the armed forces like if they were a separate entity from the regime. They are not. We have a military regime. More than half of the ministers are military. The military control the justice, the economy, the oil, the wealth of the country, and of course are the main beneficiaries of the corruption and larceny in my country. So to talk about if the military are supporting or not our cause, it is not the correct interpretation or vision. It is a military government that we're trying to get rid of. That's why you see, for example, something which will look unusual. the Lima Group, which are the Democracy for Latin America, were supporting the military who yesterday tried to help President Guaido. And you say, how is that possible that they are supporting military? Because they are supporting those military that are on the side of the institutionality and the constitution of Venezuela. That's an unheard of event that they will be supporting military in this case for the right reasons. It didn't work as it should have, like many times plans do not work. Now we're finding out why, that for 12 hours Mr. Maduro was negotiating with the top brass of the military, and now we know even with people outside the country, like a representative of the US administration. They were deliberating which way to go. And at the end, as we speak, they are still deliberating. I believe that events mark the end of the regime, and this will be just a matter of how long this is going to last. But that is definitely, it will not last long. I heard some people here saying that there was a coup d'etat, an attempt of a coup. No, an attempt of a coup d'etat is when you have an established legal government. No, here is an usurper of a regime that is being condemned by most of the democracies in Latin America. We are most possibly going to appeal to revoke the credentials of the present representative of the regime at the United Nations. And that, of course, will have to follow a process through the General Assembly, but it will do so. I prefer not to speak longer, and better wait for your questions. I am very thankful again for having the opportunity to be here. And like I said at the beginning, I always remember UNCA with great happiness for me. Thank you.
Thank you for the remarks, Ambassador. I'll open the floor for question, and I'll go with the first question. You described the situation in Venezuela as the possible biggest tragedy. And my question is, are you concerned that the conflict, the crisis in Venezuela could turn into a regional crisis?
Well, so far, in the last 2 days, we have about 200 people being wounded. So you have consequences domestically, about 300 political prisoners, and in the last few months, 50 people have been killed. Now, for the region in general, we were a country of immigrants, not a country of immigrants. Venezuelans do not move they don't like the country, they move for economic, political, social, and safety considerations. But we're now becoming a threat to the region because a lot of them that do not have the means necessary are pressuring on the institutional capabilities of those countries in the health sector, the education sector, and the social sector. So we have become actually a great problem for them. And if the situation would continue the way it's been happening lately, we will have 5 million people. We have two more million people leaving the country now. So of a country of 30 million people, we'll have about 15% of the population leaving the country. This has never happened in Latin America, in the wealthiest country of the region.
Thank you, Ambassador. Edie?
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. It's always nice to see you back here, especially for us old-timers. You said we are going to appeal to revoke the credentials of the present representative of Venezuela. Who's the we? And is there anything else that you think that the Secretary General, the Security Council, or anybody else at the UN could do?
Well, the we would be the Guaido government. You know, regarding the Secretary General, I've been very candid about what I believe has been the role of the United Nations, especially of the Secretary General and the Security Council itself. I know enough this institution to understand clearly that we always preach the sort of a moral equivalence of the parties where we consider victims and victimizers at the same level. While we did that, they killed 2 million people in Congo, 200,000 people in Bosnia, 500,000 or 800,000 in Rwanda. So, and this is, again, what have been preached to us. This must, Secretary General says, this must be a peaceful, democratic solution. And like we were not under the control of a mafia state, of a criminal gangs, of a thuggish government, regime, a gang of people. So if we do not understand that, but I believe that the Secretary General knows it, but even though they're forced, in a way, not to assume what the Charter gives him. The Charter allows the Secretary General to take initiative, a stronger initiative. And that would actually put some light into the Security Council, where we're facing basically two major countries, like Russia and China, who are siding exactly with the thuggish criminal government regime, like the case of Venezuela, which is, in my view, shameful, especially where we had in the past very close relations and good relations with Russia and with China.
Mr. Abadi?
Thank you very much. Welcome back, Ambassador, for old-timers, but you don't look like old-timer.
I'm here now.
My question has two parts. One, what are the risks of civil war in your country? And second, what should or could the Secretary General of the United Nations do at this stage? Thank you.
On the first, it's always the risk. But what we have seen in the military, at least in my country, they don't shoot each other. And we don't have a civilian population armed like it was in case in Syria or it was in case in Bosnia. It's completely unarmed. So the risks are lower. But Venezuela is an occupied country by other forces. The Cubans are at least 20,000 Cubans in my country who are in control of the intelligence services. They spy on the armed forces. They manufacture our passports and our identification cards. This is the only country in the world that have submitted to another country, like Cuba, to produce them. The Russians are in control of the most sophisticated technological equipment of Venezuela, like the anti-missiles, radars, planes. So in a way, there are two groups that control many things in my country, the Russians and the Cubans. So we are actually a occupied country. We should be asking for the removal of those people rather than for an intervention.
Frank?
I'm sorry, the role of the Secretary, in my view, should be more forceful because the dimensions of our tragedy is enough for him to invest his own personality and efforts and presence in a much more forceful manner. I believe that is lacking.
Hi, Frank Isiardo from TRT World. Thank you for being here in this press conference. Two questions. One, you were quoted in a Pan-American news service over the last 24 hours, maybe 48 hours, as saying that the only way things will be changing in Venezuela is by force. And also, I want to ask you, you at one time testified against Maduro in the International Criminal Court. And I'd like you to describe what you testified as to in that court, what you consider him to be.
Well, I read the editorial of the Wall Street Journal, and I concur with that. In the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, what I was part of, I was an advisor to Kofi Annan after I left as an ambassador here, the only country that questioned the responsibility to protect during the discussion of the United Nations in 2009 was Venezuela, followed by Sudan and Nicaragua. In Nigeria, when the president of the assembly was Father Scott of Nicaragua, said the responsibility to protect was a redecoration of imperialism, and the responsibility to protect was more, should be called the right to intervene. Within those parameters of the responsibility to protect, I believe that not much has been done, and I believe that the force is not excluded. It's the continuation of diplomacy, and when diplomacy, like Closer would say, when diplomacy is ended, the military take over. Venezuela will not come out of this without the use of force. I hope will be our own forces, and that we don't need to appeal outside, but it will be by force. It will not be conventional, because I've never seen a thuggish and criminal state controlled by mafias and narco traffickers and guerrilla leaders through diplomatic means of formal dialogue, conversations. I've never seen that. And now we took Maduro. I took Chavez to the International Criminal Court. It was the first time. That's how, after I was a witness against Milosevic and against Karadzic. And I was also a witness in the defense of the Muslim commander Orich. So I was the only person who had been 3 times in the criminal court, being a former member of the Security Council. In the Maduro case, not only myself, there are 6 governments of Latin America and 1 Canada and Germany now that have also endorsed the Organization of American States accusations against the Maduro and some of his cronies for crimes against humanity.
How did you describe him then? What did you say he did? Was he a murderer? What did you
You know, in the case of President, you never can tell that, he was shooting people, but he was allowing, for example, he was arming people, arming the paramilitary that were committing the crimes, creating torture chambers. Venezuela has become a very sophisticated in that field of torturing. It's been a lot of external help on the side of the Cubans, who were controlling the intelligence and apparatus of Venezuela. So it's a specific, and then also the persecution of specific sectors of the society. Recently, of the Pemon Indians in our Guyana region, which will be called a beginning of an euphemism, ethical cleansing of our own Indians.
Benny, Margaret, and James.
2 quick questions. First of all, what do you think should be the role of the United States in all of this? And secondly, as you mentioned, China, Russia, and Cuba, could you talk a little bit, first of all, about a little more about the role of China, and also, is there any role of Iran in involvement in Venezuela?
You know, the role of the United States, we have 2 experiences, historical experiences with the United States intervention in our affairs. The first one was when England was a great power at the time in 1898. They tried to abuse Venezuela and take most of the Guyana region. And an American president called Grover Cleveland told Lord Salisbury that the United States would not allow that to happen. And they saved us at least half of the Guyana. And later on, in 1901 or 1902, England, Italy, and Germany imposed a naval blockade on Venezuela. And again, an American president, Theodore Roosevelt, sent them packing. So if you ask me, the experience that we have with the U.S. intervening in Venezuela has been extremely productive and beneficial to us. Your second question was?
Well, first of all, what should the U.S. do now?
I will know.
Secondly,
Okay.
the second
Well,
question was about the role of China and Iran.
I think that we would not have reached a situation of so much understanding of what's happening in my country had it not been by the public interventions of American officials of this administration. I see this administration in a unidimensional way. I see what they do for my country. And there is no other administration in the United States who have been close to do that as they have. And they've been in a very forceful manner, and I believe in an attempt to dissuade and act as a force of dissuasion in Venezuela. So I've seen that as a very positive contribution to my country. In the case of Iran, we have Hezbollah people, we have Iranians, we have Chinese, we have guerrilla leaders from the FARC, from the ELN. Venezuela is a haven for many people. And the Venezuelan regime has been providing passports and visas to people that then disappear, because Venezuelan visas and passports were accepted everywhere. So now, for example, last week, there's It's a video in China where you see about 500 Chinese getting Venezuelan passports, and the Venezuelans do not have passports. You cannot have a passport in Venezuela. So we are actually, a country is being invaded, but not by force. Has been invaded because they have been welcomed and invited by the regime throughout these years. China continues to be a very important player, more on the financial side. Russia, I don't think the Russians care a bit for what happened to the Venezuelans. They are interested in finding a niche, and a strategic niche in this region to provoke the United States or to expand his ambitions as a major superpower. But it is becoming very dangerous because they are involved, even though our problem is globalized, and they are trying to get Venezuela into a sort of a Cold War scenario. You can see it here in the Security Council, where they have met it twice on Venezuela. It is a confrontation more between Russia and the United States than it is for the case of Venezuela.
Maggie?
Mr. Arias, thank you. Margaret Bashir with Voice of America. Can you tell us why you think more of the military have not defected to the opposition side?
You know, I was saying at the beginning that probably it's not correct to think of the military and the regime as separate entities. It's only one entity. It's a military regime where you have half of the minister, more than half of the minister, controlled by the army, and they control the oil, the diamonds, the gold, the mineral, the gasoline, and the justice and the economic system. You have to understand that they are fundamentally, the regime is military. So what will have to give in, or will have to collapse, is the regime itself. It's not only the armed forces, because the armed forces are absolutely part of the regime.
James?
James Bays from Al Jazeera. We've seen for weeks now a very tense standoff, showdown between the two sides in Venezuela. Arguably, in the last 48 hours, things changed a bit. Arguably, the stakes were raised. How much more dangerous is this moment now? And if you could add at the end your message right now to the people of Venezuela.
You know, I think you define it very well. It is a very tense, it's a sort of a pulse between two sides of one. Is claiming not to be removed because they are in control of the Venezuelan wealth, whatever is left. And the other side, which is the legitimate side. According to all polls, more than 85% of the country reject the present regime. So that makes it that the most important ammunition that we have is that we have the people. But they have the lethal ammunition, which is different. What I would say to my own people, you know, it's been 20 horrible years, and where we were transformed into a narco state, and the wealthiest country of the region with so many opportunities that was recognized in this institution as a fighter, promoter of human rights, and democracy in the world, has turned into the opposite, and has turned into a transgressor of the fundamental principles of this institution. And the courage that you see in the people of my country in the street is really extraordinary. President Guaidó himself is a young man, and he is in the street. He's not hiding in a bunker like Mr. Maduro, surrounded by the armed forces or by his paramilitary. You know, he's on the streets. There are thousands and thousands of young people as we speak. They will not leave the streets. I believe they will not leave it. We have an expression that say, vamos con todo. You know, we're going with everything, and I hope we preserve that.
Stefano, Evelyn, Linda, and Efe.
Yes, hello. Stefano Vaccara, La Voce di New York, Radio Radicale in Rome. Two things. One, it looks very strange. You've been saying like it's a military regime and they are in control. But we never saw a military regime in control having people or somebody coming on the square and say, I'm the legitimate president, and don't arrest them, don't kill him, don't react. I mean, the point is, how come the Maduro regime has not been this kind of regime, harsh regime that, you know, just react like anybody will expect? And the second question is, so what do you think about the European Union position that has having toward the crisis? Thank you.
Well, in the first one, they were not there to shoot Juan Guaido, for example, or to imprison him, because they don't control part of the armed forces. And they are also afraid of what the international community might react to something of that sort. And that's a proof that they do not control the country. Otherwise, like you expressed very well, he would be in jail or would have been shot. The European community, you know, if it is difficult to judge my country and what's happening from 2,000 or 3,000 miles away, the Europeans have a different look to begin with in the behavior of the foreign policy. And there are many countries there, you know, and they operate by consensus. And I know, because of my conversation with many of those countries, that they will be willing to support us in a stronger way. But a country, for example, Greece, you know, opposed it. Italy has been, you know, ambivalent. So that has made it very difficult to get the whole support of the European Union. That's been the case.
Evelyn?
Good to see you again. How are you?
It's a pleasure to see
Evelyn
you.
Leopold. Do you think the United States should give some of its food and other supplies to the Red Cross or the United Nations? And also, do you still have property in Cartagena? Do you still have a house in Venezuela? When have you last been there?
Thank you. So nice to see you. We interacted so much at the time. And, no, Chavez confiscated my properties in Venezuela, so I don't have them. Why did he do that? Because I took him to The Hague. And I've been in exile for the last 4 years with an order of arrest, because they said that there was a group of us who were conspiring against the regime. And I said, yes, I always conspire against the regime publicly. Like when I was here at the United Nations, I was always on the record. So I am always been on the record of what I consider to be a criminal state. So those expressions are not comfortable for the regime, and I'm here now almost 4 years in exile.
Linda?
Oh, the food, yes. I would tend to agree with you. I mean, I was in Cucuta, you know, and the border with Venezuela, when there was an attempt to introduce fundamentally the American food and medicines. I would agree with you, but the Red Cross and the Venezuelan chapter is controlled by the Venezuelan regime, so it's made a very difficult operation. That's why I believe that the U.S. is not willing to do it. They will be willing to give it to Caritas, for example, organizations of that sort, rather than the International Red Cross.
Linda?
Thank you, Ambassador. My question is, you said that there have basically been 20 horrible years in Venezuela, and that you complimented the Trump administration's approach to what's going on. I was wondering, given that there have been several U.S. administrations over the past 20 years, from President W. Bush to, of course, President Obama, what do you think they should have or could have done to, sort of tamp down what was happening?
Linda, it's always nice to see you.
Thank you.
You know, I will speak like there were no journalists in the room. I believe that the United States always underestimated Chavez. They said he's a buffon. And I said, yes, he's a buffon, but he's a very dangerous one. An American ambassador, remember, John Maisto, told me, Diego, we will judge him by his deeds, not by his words. And I said, John, words has a tendency to turn into deeds, and they did. It's always, and the other thing which is more serious, that the U.S., let me put it another way, with our oil, we finance the stability of the Caribbean area and of Cuba. Why? Because we're giving away oil. And the U.S. thought that if we went against Cuba, for example, not providing more oil to Cuba or to the Caribbean countries, there will be swimming people from Jamaica, Dominican Republic to Miami, like the Haitians in the past. So we paid for the stability of the Caribbean, and in a way, we pay for the peace, for the transition process the Americans are looking for in the case of Cuba. And that has been done at our expense. So well, the poor Venezuelans, are suffering a lot, but we cannot afford for these problems to be discontinued, because if that discontinue, this will affect us. This is the way I feel about it. Am I responding to your question, Linda?
Maybe a little more.
Tell me what
Maybe a little bit, if you could be a little more specific in terms of perhaps your disappointment.
Well, yes. I'm sorry, I didn't say. During the previous administration, let's go from Clinton on. They didn't raise a finger. Didn't raise a finger. And I had, a good friend there, Mother Nolbert, my very close friend. I was with her in the Security Council. But they took a very distance from the Venezuelan tragedy. President Obama, at the end, did the first sanctions. You must recognize that the first sanctions given to individuals in Venezuela were given by President Obama. But still, always at arm's length, never really sending a clear message of support. And, I am completely independent in this matter. And until President Trump said, one day coming out of the National Security meeting, he said, after talking about Korea, he mentioned Venezuela. I mean, put in Venezuela, and he said, all the options are over the table. All the big powers have the options always on the table. But he added, including the military, which he has returned yesterday to include. That has been the only time that an American administration has, in a forceful way, have expressed that they know that they are fighting a regime that is dangerous for the Venezuelans, for the region, and that something should be done about it. It's the first time.
Okay.
Embajador, muchas gracias. Mario Villar con la agencia EFE. Just to clarify your expectations for what's going to happen, you mentioned that regimes like the Maduro regime usually don't go away without the force, but you also recalled the apparent conversations that there were this week for the government to go away, or do you see any sort of negotiated solution possible in the coming weeks or months?
The use of force does not necessarily mean that you're shooting people. The use of force is, for example, what they're trying to do with Maduro, If you don't do this, if you do this, we'll let you go out in a certain way, in a dignified way, etc. The use of force is to pressure people. It's not necessarily to shoot people. You can never say that negotiations are impossible, but we have had several experiences with this regime in the last few years in which there were not the kind of negotiations that you do here at the United Nations, like we did in El Salvador, where I was one of the negotiators. No, to negotiate with the narco regime is never, I ask you, where in the world have you seen a regime completely controlled by narcos and that they own their existence to narco criminals to accept the rules of negotiation, of diplomacy, etc.? I've never seen that. So I really don't believe that is in the cards today.
Shervin?
Hi, Ambassador. Shervin Briceby, South African Broadcasting. I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about whether the U.S. intervention is actually helping the Guaido cause. Given that in parts of the world, particularly the developing world, Africa in particular, this imperialistic interference is sort of antithetical to the changes that perhaps you are seeking. I think a lot of African countries view the Trump administration's intervention as interfering in the internal affairs of a sovereign state. How do you, given the fact that you have around 54 countries supporting the Guaido, which is a minority in the world, right? It's a minority. What needs to be done to get more people on your side internationally, given the permutations I've just laid out?
You know, I appreciate the question, you know, and thinking, I was part of the Commission of the United Nations for South Africa. And actually, I brought George Goldstone, which was the first report that came to the United Nations regarding the end of apartheid under an area formula at the time. It didn't have that name. And we brought Mr. Mandela. We took him to Venezuela. No one told us that we're interfering in the South African affairs. We were pushing for Mandela in the case of South Africa. No one said these Venezuelans, imperialists, getting involved in our affairs. Neither they did in Nigeria. I was the treasurer of the African Fund when Obasanjo was the president before he was campaigning in Nigeria. And no one told me something of that I was intervening in their affairs. The United States is in this part of the continent. It's not in Africa. And they also have, they have interesting consequences of what happened in my country. Imagine, these Venezuelans are going today to Colombia, Brazil, or whatever, might want to come to Miami. Maybe they like it better. And then, you know, there's also a problem for them. So it has become a cliche, you know, oh, the Americans, you know, I'm speaking as a Venezuelan. And if you tell me you're going to help me from South Africa, welcome. And you tell me you're going to help me from the United States, more than welcome to. So it is, if you feel part of a family that is suffering, you have to accept whomever wants to help you. And I'm sure that's what you felt when you were in South Africa.
Alex?
Thank you, Ambassador. Also a question on intervention. There's been a lot of talk about military intervention in Venezuela. Mike Pompeo said force would be used if necessary. Eric Prince, the former CEO of Blackwater, proposed sending 5,000 mercenaries to Venezuela. While countries in the region have recognized Guaido, the Lima Group has been against military intervention. So 2 questions. Firstly, what do the people want? Would the Venezuelan people welcome a military intervention in their country? And secondly, what would intervention in Venezuela mean for the relative peace that has been enjoyed in the region? Thank you.
You know, first I would say, like I said a few minutes back, that we should ask for the removal of the people already occupying us. We have already intervention, Venezuela, the Cubans, the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, the Hezbollah. Now, having said that, the polls in Venezuela indicate that if President Trump would be a candidate in Venezuela, we get about 80%, because people want, not because they like Trump or not, they want to get rid of the regime. And if whomever comes in, they will vote and will support it. So it will be extremely popular. People, you know, people, some of them think that the Marines are going together and get Maduro and get those thugs out of the country. That's not going to happen. But which is the feeling? The feeling is very positive. And you know, that, like I said to the gentleman before, if you have a family that's in trouble, you are willing to really take all the measures and risks that you wouldn't do otherwise.
For the relative peace in the region?
Well, the Lima Group included that. I mean, who in a diplomatic scenario can say that they are in favor of war or force? No one. It's always dialogue, sit down, let's talk. I mean, this is diplomatic jargon. Because nobody said, no, I am in favor of you not going and shooting people. Nobody's going to say that. So for the region, they will not say it. This is like when Noriega was removed. People say, oh my God, they transgressed the Organization of American States Charter. But people were celebrating all over Latin America because they got rid of the worst criminal at the time who was in charge of a regime. It's a lot of hypocrisy of what you do in the diplomatic field and in scenarios and what governments really feel and think. That's my feeling.
Mr. Abadi has a second question.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, allow me to go back to my former questions about the possibility of peaceful settlement even at this stage. When I asked you about the role of Secretary General, you said he should be more forceful. And what he says is that his good offices are available to the 2 parties. Do you think at this stage that there is an inevitability of conflict and no possibility of peaceful settlement And what happened to the Uruguay-Mexican peace plan?
You know, of course, my views are my own personal views. I do not represent the Guaido government or nothing at all. You know, I am representing myself. On the, you can never discard that could be the case. I can imagine a scenario that, for example, today the military telling Maduro, listen, you're gonna get rid of you unless you call for elections and we call these people and we'll do A, B, or C. I cannot discard that, I mean, as an individual. Could that happen? Yes, I believe it could happen. I mean, it's in the probabilities. Is it possible? I'm not so sure. And the second, well, that, you know, I think this has been more a Mexican initiative. You know, the Mexicans are going back to the foreign policy, traditional foreign policy of respect to sovereignty, not interference in other people's issues, etc. But, and then they got together with Uruguay. Those are the only countries, and it will not fly. It hasn't got any interest by no one in Latin America, so that initiative will not fly.
Benny?
So when Bolton spoke, I think it was on Tuesday, to the press, he mentioned 3 names of people that were in connection with I don't know with the U.S., but certainly with Guaido. And today I understand that one of them, the Minister of Defense, was showing up and saying that he is all for Maduro and so on. What exactly happened there? Do you know what happened there? Can you tell us what?
Probably I know, yes, a little bit more than you, but not so much. Imagine that Elliot Abrams came yesterday and said, we have a document signed with 15 points that we had been negotiated with the Minister of Defense, with the Chief of the Military Forces, and with the President of the Venezuelan Supreme Court. And Pompeo said, eventually we'll show them. Can you imagine how Maduro is feeling these days when his own Minister of Defense have been accused by the United States that they were negotiating with him? I even said that he's not about to trust his own wife because the head of intelligence of Venezuela, General Figueras, who is not a low-ranking officer, he was the top brass of the intelligence, also left him, and it's called General Christopher Figuera. So you can imagine the level of mistrust that today Maduro is facing every time he looks at his own generals. Senator Rubio said, well, you're looking for who are the ones who were conspiring. There were 4 of them were sitting around you in the table, and it is true. They were the Americans, not only Americans. There were other countries with Americans that we don't like to mention now that were helping to negotiate with the top brass, trying to prevent the use of force. And I think that as we speak, this is going on.
Gentleman at the back.
Gracias, embajador. As I came late, I might have missed the most important part of your presentation. I just have one simple question. Do you think the Maduro regime is going to collapse soon, and why? Thank you.
I think it's unstoppable. I think when Ambassador Haley was here in another formula, she asked me, do you see light at the end of the tunnel? I said, yeah, I see a lot of light. The problem is I don't know the length of the tunnel. And this is precisely what's happening today. But the tunnel, the length of the tunnel is shorter and shorter because I believe that these events that are taking place now have shown first that there's a fragmentation of the armed forces. Second, they are not as unified, they are not in control as they think. They cannot even put in jail President Guaido. And increasingly, the international community has been finally in support of us. So I believe this is unstoppable. And I believe it should not take too long because we also have another problem, that the sanctions imposed on the country, not on the individuals, if they take too long, this might become a problem. So I'm sure all the parties that are working, that we are working on this matter, understand that these events should be, in a way, short-circuited soon.
Do we have any other questions? Ambassador, if you have any final remarks?
Well, I am more than thankful that you have been patient enough to hear to my own individual and personal. I love the house. I've been part of this house, and probably I love it so much that I've been very critical, because you're always critical of the people who are closer to you and that you love more. And I respect you a lot, and I'm very thankful that you have come here today. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you.
Pardon me?
Will you have a role in the Guaido government?
I don't believe so. I am too independent. I'm very uncomfortable for the political parties in my country, like I was very uncomfortable when I was in the Security Council. I was too independent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, for this press conference on behalf of the United Nations Correspondents Association. Thank you.
Thank you very much.